This week on Act Out, trans rights are human rights, because human rights are only valid if they include every person in their entirety. Next, mining on land is so 20th century. The new frontier of mining is just as deep and dark as it is terrifying and catastrophic. And finally, we hear from the Wet'suwet'en on their ongoing battle to preserve their ancestral homelands. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. An orange flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Late last week, bills attacking trans youth were heard by committees in Alabama, Arizona, and Colorado. According to the ACLU's numbers from last week, more than a dozen other states have introduced bills or have bills in committee that restrict trans rights, aka human rights. And it's important that we look at it through that lens so that we don't lose trans rights to some sort of auxiliary or offshoot movement. Trans rights are human rights. Whatever your gender, you should simply and resolutely acknowledge the right of every human being to embody their gender identity. And you should see trespasses against this autonomy as trespasses against basic human rights that can, have, and will be used to trespass against other groups and other identities, sometimes in the same person. Something that has come up in LGBTQ spaces recently is the idea of the whole person, the whole identity, and the intersections that exist in people. For instance, earlier this month, 27 trans women were transferred from a detention facility in New Mexico to other camps around the country, following reports of abuse and, quote, inadequate health care at the Cibola Detention Center. Advocacy groups have not been told exactly where these women have been transferred to, which is heightening fear that their effective disappearance will be covered up. As trans women, these migrants face even more violence and hostility at the hands of ICE and Border Patrol than cisgendered migrants. And that's saying a hell of a lot when you consider the violence and oppression that migrants face as they flee what basically amounts to U.S. imperialism in the global South. Still, stories like these highlight the importance of connecting our struggles and recognizing again the whole person, the whole picture of human rights that extends in hundreds of directions based on gender, race, sexuality, disability, education, geography, and on and on and on and on. If we try to nitpick which aspects of our personhood are worthy of human rights, we will soon find that any and all aspects of our personhood can be stripped of those basic human rights. Moving on, as our focus falls rightfully on extreme and grotesque mining operations here on land, we would be forgiven for thinking that's the main battlefield, really the only place to look for the worst of the worst in environmental destruction at the hands of humans. We would be forgiven, yes, but we'd be wrong. Much like the continuous waves of violent colonizers just couldn't keep their minds and mitts off the rest of this vast land, big money and big mining just can't seem to keep their assholery on dry land. A recent article in The Atlantic outlines a new frontier of mining, the deep ocean. Many companies have already started the deep dive to new heights of human dumb shittery. Still others, actually many others, are vying like bloodthirsty vampires for the chance to literally carve up the deep ocean floor, a habitat we know next to nothing about, but from what we do know, we can certainly say, this idea is shit. At full capacity, these companies expect to dredge thousands of square miles a year. Their collection vehicles will creep across the bottom in systematic rows, scraping through the top 5 inches of the ocean floor. Ships above will draw thousands of pounds of sediment through a hose to the surface, remove the metallic objects known as polymetallic nodules, and then flush the rest back into the water. Some of that slurry will contain toxins such as mercury and lead, which could poison the surrounding ocean for hundreds of miles. The rest will drift in the current until it settles in nearby ecosystems. One conservative and early estimate suggests that each mining ship will release roughly 2 million cubic feet of discharge every day. That's enough to fill a freight train 16 miles long. Other estimates have shown numbers 3 times that amount. Ultimately, it's really difficult to estimate the level of destruction that these operations will cause. Whatever mining devastation looks like on land, it is amplified in the ocean, in no small part thanks to ocean currents. For instance, the International Seabed Authority, or ISA, has adopted an estimate that sediment dumped near the surface will travel no more than 62 miles from the point of release, but many experts believe the slurry could travel farther. A recent survey of academic research compiled by Greenpeace actually concluded that mining waste could travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. And if we look at how mining companies regard cleanup and reclamation on land, do we really want to hang our hope on reclamation in the deep sea? Reclamation, which I might add, is basically impossible. In that same report, the ISA shows an example of a 26-year-old mining tract that looks basically the same way it did when it was dredged. In the very next slide, the ISA asks how long it might take for nodule-specializing fauna to recover. Oh, just some millennia, because the nodules themselves only grow a few millimeters every million years. And these are the same guys that came out with the conservative estimate on how far dumped sediment will travel. In other words, untold devastation that we can never hope to fix in 100 lifetimes. And contrary to what some might believe, the deep ocean isn't some uninhabitable wasteland where we're only talking about losing or destroying a creepy-looking mollusk or two. In fact, prime mining target, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, or CCZ, a 1.7 million square mile stretch of ocean between Hawaii and Mexico, has been found to be teeming with life. As University of Hawaii oceanographer Jeff Drazen explained, it's one of the most biodiverse areas that we've ever sampled on the abyssal plains. Most of those microbes, he said, live on the very same nodules that miners are planning to extract. When you lift them off the seafloor, you're removing a habitat that took 10 million years to grow. Whether or not those microbes can be found in other parts of the ocean is unknown. A lot of the less mobile organisms, Drazen said, may not be anywhere else. One might hear this and think, holy fuck, what kind of psychopaths are actually considering doing this? And while I agree with your emotional response, if we dig a bit deeper, pardon the pun, we find that the people pushing hard for this are people who think that they're doing what's necessary to save the planet. For instance, Gerard Barron, CEO of a company literally called Deep Green, believes that the world will not survive if we continue burning fossil fuels, and the transition to other forms of power will require a massive increase in battery production. He points to electric cars. The batteries for a single vehicle require 187 pounds of copper, 123 pounds of nickel, and 15 pounds each of manganese and cobalt. On a planet with 1 billion cars, the conversion to electric vehicles would require several times more metal than all existing land-based supplies. And harvesting that metal from existing sources already takes a human toll. And here is where we find a covert enemy in our fight for a livable and sustainable future. Fossil fuel companies are easy and obvious targets. The mining giants that carve out mountains and forests for lumps of toxic coal, duh, of course they're fucking evil. But this guy, these companies, the industrial scale companies that want to cut down a forest to build a solar or wind farm, the companies that want to dredge the depths of the ocean to create more batteries, that go into, for instance, 1 million electric cars that in turn will produce some 250,000 tons and 500,000 cubic meters of unprocessed pack waste when these vehicles reach the end of their lives. Those astonishing numbers come from a recent report that highlights the huge gap in recycling that we're facing as we steam full speed towards battery-powered lives. Do I agree that we have to move away from fossil fuels? Again, duh. Of course we do, but how in the fuck does it make sense to move from one climate devastation to another and call it progress? As our oceans are suffocating under the weight of human stupidity and avarice, we really feel that our only option is to sink the knife in deeper and destroy millions of miles of ocean ecosystem. I call bullshit. It's well past time that we recognize two harsh but necessary truths. One, just because something isn't fossil fuels doesn't mean that it's inherently sustainable and green. And two, in order to survive, we have to significantly cut our levels of consumption. And we've talked about this point on the show before. We can't continue on like this. But not just because we're consuming in dirty ways, but because we're consuming in such excessive ways. The planet can't sustain this throwaway culture, regardless of whether that culture is fueled by dead dinosaurs or prehistoric deep-sea creatures. The way forwards has to be based on this fundamental drawdown of consumption combined with localized methods of truly sustainable energy. Corporate power, the industrial scale reach of capitalism cannot coexist with a livable future. It just can't. Not for us, not for any of the millions of plants and animal species we have in our crosshairs. As oceanographer Jeff Drazen succinctly put it, we're about to make one of the biggest transformations that humans have ever made to the surface of the planet. We're going to strip mine a massive habitat, and once it's gone, it isn't coming back. Finally, today we head to Socalled Canada and the ongoing fight of the Wet'suwet'en against fossil fuel colonialism. For a quick recap, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have made their unanimous opposition of the proposed project quite clear, and stand resolute on their unceded ancestral lands against CGL and all pipelines. The proposed Trans-Canada Coastal GasLink pipeline would run approximately 670 kilometers across northern British Columbia. The past couple of weeks have seen an escalation in colonial violence against the Wet'suwet'en, and in response, resistance and solidarity actions have escalated in kind. For instance, last week, British Columbia Lieutenant Governor Janet Austin was slated to open the spring session of the British Columbia Legislature with a throne speech. Yes, that's what it's called. Unfortunately for her, though, Indigenous youth had other plans. As the Times columnist reported, all outdoor ceremonial aspects of the speech from the throne, including the rolling out of the red carpet, were cancelled as a group of Indigenous youth who have blocked the entrance to the legislature building for more than 5 days, stage another rally in support of Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in their opposition to Coastal GasLink's pipeline project in northern BC. An online map was also set up to showcase ongoing rail blockades across Canada. One such blockade, set up by Tyendinaga Mohawks, disrupted rail service between Toronto and Montreal. Folks blocking the rail said that they planned to be there until RCMP left Wet'suwet'en territories, despite a recent injunction which forbids any continued interference with the rail line under the threat of arrest. Mohawk member Jacob Morris said of the injunction, "It's a piece of paper in our eyes, another tree cut down so you can hand it to us. I'm not worried one bit." Here to talk more about these powerful and vital actions and the resolve of the Wet'suwet'en is Jennifer Wickham, media coordinator for Gidimt'en Camp. So, just to start off with some basic questions, so folks know where we're at. What does it mean when they say that it's unceded territory?
Unceded territory means that we've never given it up and we've never transferred title to anybody.
Gotcha. And this has been going on for quite some time. The battle for resources in that area. What changed recently that brought on this escalation of colonialist violence in the past week or so?
Well, the assertion of our jurisdiction and sovereignty over our territory has been happening for a really long time, and there have been many proposed pipelines to come through our headwaters, and in one way or another, we've always been able to stop that from happening. So either through funding not being secured or some other thing has happened where the pipeline hasn't actually started to be built. And this is the first pipeline that has been started to be built, or the right-of-way has started to be cleared for this pipeline. The hereditary chiefs took every avenue possible to them in order to stop the pipeline and have their jurisdiction respected, their rights and title to be respected for this project. And all of those means had been exhausted. And so there was no other choice but for the hereditary chiefs to serve CGL with an eviction notice.
And was there a specific response from CGL, or did it just end with RCMP showing up?
When the eviction notice was first served, CGL complied. They left the territory. And then it was up to the RCMP to do the enforcement. And it actually took them quite a long time. So it was over a month from the time that CGL was evicted on January 4th until they started actually coming in and starting the 5-day raid on Wet'suwet'en territory.
And with that...
So in that time...
Sorry, go ahead.
In that time, the hereditary chiefs asserted that they would not meet with any stakeholders. They wanted a nation-to-nation conversation, which means that they wanted to meet with John Horgan and Justin Trudeau. And so at one point, John Horgan had tried to phone and have a conversation with just one of our chiefs, and he told him that he can't just call one chief on the phone. He needs to meet with all of the title holders, which is all of our hereditary chiefs. And so they sent Minister Fraser to come up and as a representative to try and have a conversation with the chiefs. And after 2 days of meetings, Coastal GasLink decided that things were not going in their favor, and so they ordered the enforcement.
And RCMP just went along with that, even though the meetings were ongoing?
After those 2 days of meetings, the meetings stopped because the company had decided that things were not moving forward the way that they wanted. So they gave the direction for the RCMP to enforce.
Which is just really indicative of this history that you mentioned, that a pipeline company has the power to tell a government's law enforcement that they want them to do something.
Yeah, the Coastal GasLink has been given more rights than the actual citizens of this territory.
And with the raid, what are some of the charges that folks? I know that I saw that several people have been released, but what charges are they being hit with?
So all of the folks that were actually charged, and there were 6 people that were taken. They were taken out of their beds at 5 a.m. They were not charged with anything. They were released after being held for, I think it was 13 or 14 hours. The 14 or 15 people that have been charged are charged civilly with a breach of the injunction.
And talk about the railroad blockades that are ongoing. What's the significance of those?
Well, the railway is used to transport all of the resources from Indigenous communities. So the railway has always been a way for industry to steal resources from Indigenous people. And so putting a halt on the transport of those resources is hitting Canada and British Columbia and industry where they're going to take notice. Wet'suwet'en territory specifically, when the railway first was built, within the first year, there was $2 million worth of resources extracted from our territory. And that was in, I believe, nope, can't remember the year.
Like a rough estimate?
That's a long time ago.
Yeah.
I think it was 1941.
Okay.
No.
But like the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Okay.
So 2 million resources back then, $2 million worth of resources back when the railway first opened in our territory is equivalent to billions of dollars now. And that was just in the first year.
And of course, there was no deal made then either in terms of the Wet'suwet'en allowing this to happen.
No, the Wet'suwet'en never gave consent for the railway. They've never given consent for the resources. They've never given consent for anybody that has been trespassing and stealing our resources on our territory.
And with regards to what's going on right now, something that Indigenous people in the so-called United States have talked about is the importance of recognizing Indigenous rights in order to have a livable future. Could you talk about that from your perspective?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so something that Indigenous folks in the United States have talked a lot about is the need to recognize Indigenous rights in order to have a livable future. Could you talk about that from your perspective, how you see that connection?
The Wet'suwet'en people have been managing our territories in a sustainable way for thousands and thousands of years. And since colonization, we have seen the desecration of our territories, the decline of animals, the decline of fresh drinking water, and Wet'suwet'en, which is the river, the headwaters that they plan to put the pipeline underneath, is one of the last sources of clean drinking water in the world. You can drink straight out of the river, and they don't care about that or have no respect for the laws that have governed this territory for millennia, since time immemorial. And there have been many scientists and environmentalists that have stated exactly that if we followed Indigenous law in the territories where we're living, we know what it takes to sustain those territories and maintain a healthy ecosystem. For example, we no longer have caribou in our territory, and that is what our ancestors lived on since the beginning of time. We used to also have elk in our territory, and now we have very few. Moose are an invasive species, but even the moose population is in decline. And that comes from different industry. It comes from the railways. It comes from logging and mining and now pipelines. They want to put a pipeline and roads through one of our last untouched, pristine ecosystems within our territory.
What are your demands as of right now?
We want to see the RCMP out of our territory. They don't have jurisdiction over us. We've never signed a treaty. We want recognition of our rights and our title and our jurisdiction to manage our territories as all of our ancestors have done.
And what are
We want British Columbia and Canada to abide by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which includes free, prior, and informed consent.
What are the plans moving forward right now?
Right now, our hereditary chiefs are in discussion with each other and with our community members, and they maintain that this project and this company does not have free, prior, and informed consent. And so right now is a time for us to regroup and take the necessary steps forward, whether they be legally within the court system or otherwise. It's a process that we're going through right now.
And outside of course, on the website, there's instructions on how people can help where they're at. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with folks on how they can support that might not be on the website, or anything that you'd like to add that I might have missed?
I think one of the main things that isn't on our website and things people can do wherever they are in the world is to build relationships with the Indigenous people where they are. Find out whose territory you're living on and build relationships with them and find out what their laws are. And for the Indigenous people to start asserting their sovereignty in their jurisdiction and reenacting their laws in their territory. If this world is going to survive, that's what everybody needs to start doing.
For more information, visit unastoten.camp, where you'll find tools for solidarity actions and other ways to support. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter, and if you can, donate to keep our work going beyond the weekly show. Beyond next week, actually, as it were. More information about that upcoming shift is available via patreon.com/actout. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since your push to serve my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I will kill for what I